Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast with Dr. Jessie Mahoney
and Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
We are physicians and leaders who are also trained in coaching, yoga, mindfulness, and integrative medicine.
We are also mothers, spouses, sisters, daughters, aunts, and friends.
In this podcast, we share candid, heart-centered, loving, science-based, thoughtful, and often fun conversations about the challenges life throws at us.
With our collective experience of over 30 years in physician and personal wellness, we reflect and offer pearls of wisdom for navigating life's challenges with more ease.
From parenting, marriages, money scarcity, cancer survivorship, uncertainty, challenges in practicing medicine, we cover it all.
We invite you to refresh your perspective and empower yourself with mindset, mindfulness, and other well-being tools that actually work. A quick reminder that nothing in our podcast is medical advice.
Today, I'm going to share a fun topic that people have been asking me to record a podcast on for a long time. How to navigate different libidos with mindful love and strategy. Do you and your partner have different levels of desire for sex and intimacy? Do libido differences cause tension in your relationship? Do you feel guilty, blame, or shame about disparities in your sexual desire? If this is you, keep listening. The inspiration for this topic came because many high-achieving professional women struggle with this issue. I coach on it all the time. It usually doesn't come up in the beginning of coaching. It usually comes up after we have been coaching for a while. And this issue bubbles up as one that needs addressing, one that is causing challenges in relationship, parenting, family. And as I very often say in this podcast, everything affects everything. We can't separate work from home. We can't separate the integrity of our marriage from the integrity of our parenting. And so it is a relevant topic for the Mindful Healers podcast. Studies show that a lack of interest in sex is by far the most common and distressing sexual problem. And when sex suffers, so do all other areas of our life. So the intention of today's podcast is to normalize the challenge of mismatched libidos in long-term relationships and to help you think about this mindfully, lovingly, non-judgmentally, and strategically. I hope that after listening, you will take away the thought that mindfulness and mindset are the solution, that they can help you find connection and help you problem solve mismatched libidos creatively. So as we do here at the Mindful Healers podcast, I want to invite you to pause, to arrive, and to settle in for the conversation. Taking some deep breaths. If you find yourself feeling tense, taking a few more deep breaths. And perhaps setting an intention for openness, open-heartedness, open-mindedness, perhaps some loving amusement, and perhaps some curiosity. I invite you here to bring a hand to heart, as mismatched libidos is 100% a hand to heart topic. Can you send yourself compassion? Your partner compassion? Your relationship compassion? And coming back to your breath. And setting this intention to settle in and listen. So starting off by saying that I am not an expert on sex by any means. but that I do coach on this topic all the time. I have also done a previous podcast on mindful intimacy, which I encourage you all to listen to. It is a Mindful Healers podcast from 2021, I believe, perhaps 2022. I also recorded a previous podcast with Kelly Casperson, a urologist who is the author of You Are Not Broken. And that podcast was titled Our Brain is Our Biggest Sex Organ. And because the brain is the biggest sex organ in your body, it's not surprising that mindfulness and coaching are key to finding solutions to different levels of sexual desire in long-term relationships. Mindfulness helps you cultivate desire. It helps you increase pleasure when you do have sex, and it helps you find connection and joy in your relationship. When you are feeling connection and joy, you generally have a higher libido. When you are feeling resentment, bitterness, anger, disappointment, you generally have a lower libido. And so thinking about how to evaluate your thought patterns, your default ones, and how they may actually be also impacting your libido and level of interest in intimacy with your partner, something that we don't usually consider. We usually consider it just a physiologic baseline thing. And so this podcast is to encourage you to step out of the underlying desire physiology of it and step into your mind. Now, the mind, of course, impacts physiology, as we often talk about here on the podcast, but starting with the mind. According to Dr. Emily Nagoski, who wrote Come As You Are, she has a new book called Come Together, and she has an amazing TED Talk on this topic of mismatched sexual desires. And she says what's needed to sustain strong sexual desire over multiple decades of a relationship is two things: a strong friendship and to prioritize sex. So I encourage you all to take a listen to her TED Talk. It's fabulous. She also shares in that TED Talk something that I think will help at the outset of this podcast. So she talks about when you are at home thinking about going to a party, and that very often you are too tired. It seems like too much work. You don't really want to go. You don't really want to get dressed up. Seems like it might be too complicated. And then when you get there, it ends up being fun. You feel alive. You enjoy connection, and you're glad you went. And so she likens that to intimacy in the long-term relationship for many of us. And that story resonated for me. And if you think about her story, much of that, the not wanting to go, the feeling too tired, the low energy, comes from thoughts about it. It's our story is that it's too much work. Our story is that it won't be worth it. Our story is that we're too tired. And while we may be physically tired, we can even sometimes go physically tired and still have fun. And so thinking about the thoughts there with the party analogy and how they get in your way. I'm going to jump right into what I'm going to call Jessie's strategic approach to navigating different sexual desires in long-term relationships or navigating differing libidos. So number one is get checked out medically if you have a lack of desire or what is turning into problematic libido. If it bothers you. If it doesn't bother you, you don't need to do anything. But if it's creating tension in your relationship, then get checked out medically. There are so many reasons, that physiologic reasons, that can cause it. And very often we just decide it's because we're too tired. We decide it's because we're going through menopause or perimenopause or something else. And it turns out that there is something physiologic. Remembering that hormones have a huge impact And medications can have a huge impact, and so many physical challenges can impact your libido. And so making sure you get checked out medically and reminding you that nothing in this podcast is medical advice. Number 2 is to show up with compassion for yourself and your partner. Remembering that compassion is one of the key tenets of mindfulness. And everything else on this list, if Jessie's strategic approach to navigating different sexual desires relates to mindfulness and coaching. And so compassion is the main tenet of mindfulness. And number 1, compassion for yourself. Again, I mentioned that these different libidos in long-term relationships is really a hand-to-heart moment, a hand-to-heart that everyone hopes that they would have the same libido, and yet, of course, we don't. At different times, we all have different levels of interests and different levels of energy and other things going on in our lives. So showing up with hand-to-heart compassion, and perhaps even that physical practice of hand-to-heart when the issue arises. And also compassion for your partner. Compassion for potentially their frustration, likely equal to your frustration, with the differences. Nobody likes differences. Nobody wants differences. Everyone wishes that it were different. And yet all we can do is engage in ways that can make a difference. And showing up with compassion for one another and love for one another, love for yourself and love for your partner, is the way forward. When we show up with frustration about this issue or literally any other issue, we generally lower our libido. We feel disconnected and we create more stress and tension. And if you follow the physiology of that, you're releasing cortisol and norepinephrine, and not in a good place for connection or love. Number 3 is to also notice these differences without judgment, remembering that non-judgment is a tenet of mindfulness. Judging yourself for having some problem, i.e. Kelly Casperson's "you are not broken," judging your partner that they should be different doesn't help. So showing up without a judgment is powerful. Remembering that we were trained in our medical careers to show up for everything with judgment. And so your default will be to be judgmental. So remembering that and trying to show up with non-judgment. Other possibilities are neutral, kindness, compassion, as I mentioned. Curiosity would be another one. So if you're struggling to just have no judgment, choose another option. And we'll talk about a few other options. Number 4 is to stay out of blame, shame, and guilt. And it's, of course, related to being non-judgmental, but remembering that many of us were trained to show up with levels of differences or things that cause tension with blame, blaming ourselves or others. Shame is very much a default pattern, especially around topics of sex and libidos, and guilt that we should have a higher sex drive, or maybe our partner should have a lower one, or so many reasons to feel guilty. Guilt about not spending time with our children, guilt about not being in good shape, all kinds of things. So the invitation here is to stay out of blame, shame, and guilt. It only serves to make a hard thing where we have differences harder. Number 5 is to accept and allow, or accept and not like your differences. So you can accept and allow, for example, different seasons of young children, seasons of pregnancy, seasons of menopause, seasons of surgeries, all kinds of things that you might just need to accept and allow. Staying out of resisting reality is powerful. When we resist the reality of whatever our human conditions might be at that point, it's very expensive emotionally and energetically. You could also accept and not like that you have differences. And again, I think many times we think that the differences might all be that the woman identifying as female is less interested and the person identifying as male is more interested, but that's not necessarily true. It's also not necessarily true. It's possible that the person potentially identifying as male or maybe in a same-sex relationship, obviously there might not even be a male, but these medical issues can be on either side. Mental health issues tend to cause problems with sex, depression. Antidepressants tend to cause issues with libido as well. So allow yourself to accept and not like the fact that you have differing interests at this time. Remembering also that it's very common to have similar levels of libido in a new relationship, but over decades of a relationship, there are very likely to be times where you have different levels of interest. You also might accept and allow or accept and not like that the conflict causes or the differences cause different reactions in different people. Your partner may be frustrated. Your partner may be disappointed. Your partner may be angry. And so accepting and allowing that everyone gets to show up for this in whatever way they would like. When we accept, we let go, and it gives us a chance to show up for things with a little bit more spaciousness and a little bit more curiosity and a little bit more creativity. And remembering that curiosity is another tenet of mindfulness. And so when we accept and allow or accept and not like, acceptance being a tenet of mindfulness, it gives us the gift of being curious. Number 6 is have patience. Patience with each other. We don't have to solve things urgently. Being patient is a beautiful way to move forward. And being patient also with different life seasons. Being patient with recoveries from surgery, being patient with different medical issues, being patient with a diagnosis of depression, being patient with medication adjustments, being patient with life with toddlers and babies, being patient perhaps with anxiety and poor sleep, being patient, realizing that just because something is happening now doesn't mean it will happen forever. Remembering it's not all or none, remembering that everything is temporary, and that very often in long-term relationships, there are life seasons. Now, one of you may be able to be patient and accept and allow the life seasons, and another may not, remembering that we can't coach other people. We can only control ourselves and our own reaction and response to our differing libidos. And so navigating these situations requires focusing on what's in your control, which is you. You can, of course, point out how you're showing up, but you can't change the other person. And so also what's in your control here is if the other person is not being patient with you or the other person is frustrated, remembering that all you can control is how you show up for that. So number 7 is to drop or let go of your all or nothing thinking, your right or wrong thinking, and your catastrophizing. That seems relatively simple and something we talk about here all the time. The key to this is to notice it. Number 8 is to think generously about the situation. Remembering that it is actually good that one partner still wants to have sexual intimacy with the other, even if there's a mismatch. Imagine if they didn't, that would be worse. Also thinking generously is that generally your partner is just like you, and I put that in quotes, and that they want a happy, healthy relationship. They're also just like you generally because they want connection. And so it's just that you have different ideas of how to get there. So oftentimes one person needs connection in order to want intimacy. The other person wants intimacy because that's how they connect. And so just recognizing that what you both want is connection. and you just have different ideas of how to get there or different preferences of how to get there, take some of the tension and judgment out. Number 9 is to set intentions, and reminding you that the process of setting intentions is to tell your reticular activating system how to filter information. Setting intentions also focuses your attention on something. When we don't focus our attention on something, it focuses on the negative. That's what's the default. And so choosing an intention, perhaps for connection, or choosing an intention as recommended by Emily Nagoski to prioritize intimacy, that can be very helpful. Letting your brain focus on something that matters. You can also choose an intention such as love. I often talk about what would love do, and you could ask that question here. What would love do about navigating different libidos? What would love do about a season of young children? What would love do about a season of health issues or a mental health diagnosis? You can ask, what would connection do about this difference in levels of sexual desire, for example? Number 10 is to practice presence. And when we are not present, that means we're generally looking behind and perhaps practicing regret, judgment, focusing what we should have done, ruminating about something that happened during our day, or we're focusing ahead, anxiety, worry, etc., and planning and not being in the present moment. And it's very hard to have interest in sexual intimacy if you are not in the present moment. It's also very hard to enjoy it. It's hard to allow pleasure. It's hard to focus on pleasure, and it's hard to find connection if you're not present. So the joy is found in presence. Connection is found in presence, but it takes practice. And so this is where developing a mindfulness practice can help you tremendously. And so if you have a mindfulness practice, then you work on being able to drop into presence with much more ease. It allows you to also enjoy sex more, because mindful sex is actually a thing. And there are several books written on it, and I encourage you to explore them. But the short version is that, of course, if you're mindful and you're tied into your 5 senses, for example, that you might enjoy it more. If you are not tied into your body and your mind is one place and your body's in another and your spirit is focusing on something else, it's hard to desire intimacy. So growing a mindfulness practice, starting wherever you are, remembering that I always say everyone can grow a mindfulness practice. It just takes practice. That is one of the things that we work on at retreats, is growing a sustainable mindfulness practice that works for you. So if you want to be able to take a break from your responsibilities, get your partner to watch your kids, get your partner to take care of other responsibilities, and come join me on a retreat. Grow your ability to be mindful and be present. And it just might bring you into a different place in terms of sexual intimacy. So your partner might be willing to support that journey. Number 11 is an interesting one. It's another tenet of mindfulness, which is non-striving. And we tend to strive for certain outcomes. And there is a great TED Talk about striving in terms of sex, and striving in terms of outcomes and orgasms, or that it should look this way, or it should be this frequency, or it should, any shoulds is generally striving. And as most of us in medicine are strivers. And so when you're practicing mindfulness and you are thinking about different levels of desire, staying away from the striving, staying away from what it's supposed to look like, and instead creating something that works well for you and your relationship can be super powerful. So there are a few more, and they relate to the prerequisites for change that I have spoken about. And they are also the same 3 prerequisites that are needed to have a healthy sex drive, or a healthy libido, recognizing that there isn't a right one to have, but that without these things, you certainly are not going to be at your best. And no one wants to have sex when they are completely depleted or on empty. No one wants to have sex when they are in fight or flight or sympathomimic storm. And generally, nobody feels like they want sexual intimacy when they are judging themselves, feeling ugly, being mean to themselves, and lacking in self compassion. And so, those three prerequisites there are number one, to nourish and replete yourself. Find a way to replete your energy, to restore and rejuvenate. And whether that is yoga, whether that is mindfulness, whether that is a retreat, whether that is sleep, whether that is nature, whether that is pausing, finding things that get you off of empty is very helpful. And prioritizing that and taking time for that can be a game changer. No one has a healthy libido when they're stressed and depleted. You also need to take good care of your parasympathetic nervous system. Again, practicing mindfulness and or yoga. This is why mindfulness is so powerful. And as I talk about very often, there are so many ways to do this, but we generally have no interest in sex when we are on fight or flight, when our nervous system is overactive, when we are stressed, and when we are in sympathomimetic storm. And then the compassion piece, which I spoke about before, being kind to yourself, being kind to your partner, and telling good stories and having healthy narratives about your body and what it looks like and what it's been through and all it's accomplished and achieved and created, rather than focusing on the negative. Remembering that when we don't tell our brain what to pay attention to, it looks at the negative. So choosing stories and narratives and telling your brain, setting an intention to focus on the positive, choosing what to pay attention to. I told my husband I was recording this podcast, and he's like, "Oh, do I get to be on that one?" And I asked him, "Well, okay, if you were on this one, which I'm definitely going to record by myself, what would you say?" And he said, "Well, when you're frustrated, you won't be interested in having sex with your partner. And so you should stay out of frustration. You should appreciate them and focus on the positive." And I would say that that's true. So choose what to pay attention to. With intention, focus on the things that you enjoy about your partners, focus on the things that you like, and stay out of focusing on the negatives. Remembering that the longer we're with someone, we always focus on the negatives. When we're first with someone, we focus on all the positives. And of course, we have much better matched libidos. And as we get farther and farther into it, we tend to shift and we tend to focus on what is annoying us rather than what we love so dearly. So choosing what to pay attention to and telling good stories and healthy narratives so that you're not feeling bad about yourself and feeling bad about the situation, and you're not dousing yourself with cortisol, resentment, anger, frustration, and disappointment. You also want to ensure that you're telling good stories / healthy narratives about pleasure itself. Many of us were raised in not sex positive families, and our culture has a lot of shame, blame, and guilt just around the idea of pleasure, especially for women. And is it indulgent? Do we have time for it? And a lot of us are kind of uncomfortable with that concept. And so telling a healthy narrative about that can be quite powerful. And also the narrative that you tell about the mismatch itself. Notice I'm using the word mismatch rather than something that's more judgmental. There isn't a better person or a worse person. You just are not matched up. Your desires are not the same at this moment. And so I like to choose words carefully. And mismatch to me is kind of a light way of thinking about it. You could also approach it with loving amusement, that at maybe there's a time when one partner isn't as interested because of a medical issue, and another time the other partner's not. And so can you have a little bit of loving amusement that your timing isn't lined up? Because of course it's not, because that's how life works. And then the last of Jessie's strategic, mindful, loving tips for navigating different sexual desires is to get help. We know that getting help helps. And because so much of the challenges are around thought patterns and mindfulness and coaching, it's actually a great topic for coaching. When you clean up your mind and you have healthy brain, healthy thought patterns, remembering that your brain is the biggest sexual organ in your body. All of this coaching and mindfulness makes a huge difference. So a little bit of a nudge here to join me for a retreat in particular, because that's where we work on the mindfulness piece and the presence and the nervous system and the repletion, as well as the thought patterns, all at the same time. But you can also do this as part of my relationship groups, the Mindful Love relationship group, which will be starting towards the end of March. And I only offer it once a year. It's an amazing small group, which is not at all focused on sex, by the way. But we do talk about bringing mindfulness and compassion and the power of stories in relationships, and all the tools about the ways that we look at our partners and the thought patterns that we have and where they cause us problems. They cause us the same problems around libido mismatch as co-parenting mismatches, and so many other mismatches in relationships, even in loving relationships. And so as I near the end of the podcast, just remembering that generally, whether or not we have similar levels of sexual desire or not, we generally want the same things out of our relationship. We generally want to have happy, healthy, connected, loving relationships. And can you tap back into how you are just like your partner, how you want the same things for the most part? You just have different ideas about how to get there. And then connecting back to Emily Nagoski's suggestions of strong friendship, which requires trust and connection, and remembering that as physicians, we tend to struggle with trust, and that we need to practice that. And we tend to focus on the negative, and we need to practice focusing on the positive. And we also tend to not prioritize intimacy. And so we have to decide that it matters. And we have to put it on the priority list. And the way that I like to think about this from a strategic standpoint is that divorce is expensive. Unhealthy relationships are expensive. They impact you, they impact your children, they impact your ability to work when things aren't going well. And while this might seem like a side thing, it never remains a side thing. And so deciding, asking your future self how you will wish you'd shown up for a moment in time or a season of mismatched libidos. A few reflection questions. Can you tell good stories about pleasure for yourself, pleasure for your partner, pleasure for your relationships? What does your partner do well? What's working? How are you and your partner well matched? What would non-judgment do about your mismatched libidos in this current season? What would love do? What would compassion do? What would connection do? What would strategic do? What would loving amusement do? What would curiosity do? What would patience do? so many options of useful questions. And inspired by Emily Nagoski, what might you do to strengthen your friendship? What would it take for you to prioritize sex? And with that, thank you all for listening. Hopefully, this podcast has given you some ideas on what's often a heated and tense subject. Remembering hand to heart, remembering compassion, and remembering also the opportunity to get help. And a nudge again to join me for Mindful Love small group coaching or even one-on-one coaching and or a retreat. There is so much that you can do to reconnect and have a better relationship even with mismatched libidos, and perhaps ways to move forward with curiosity, love, non-judgment, and creativity. Thanks so much for joining me today. Have a beautiful week.
Thanks so much for joining us.
We encourage you to dive into the show notes for each episode for more learnings and resources.
We also invite you to take a listen to the many other Mindful Healers podcast episodes. And please share the podcast far and wide with colleagues, friends, and family.
If our message and approach resonate with you, we would love to work with you.
When you listen to a podcast, you consume information, but when you work with us, you can actually practice and change.
We offer coaching and mindfulness experiences, talks, workshops, retreats, and more. Connect with us at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
The content of this podcast is not medical or life advice. We invite you to participate in the mindful moments we offer at the end of most of our podcasts, but please only do so safely. Thank you so much for joining in this mindful moment offering. Today, we're going to be inviting you to practice some loving kindness directed specifically for yourself. Inviting you to take a moment to ground and arrive for this practice. If it's safe for you to do so, feel free to close your eyes or lower your gaze a few inches in front of you, noticing the supporting surface that you are standing or sitting upon. Next, inviting you to bring both hands to the heart, pushing in just a little bit, noticing the sensations of the hands against the chest, a symbol of unconditional support. And as you're ready, bringing into your mind's eye a loved one, someone that you have bestowed unconditional love to. It could be a family member, a partner, a pet, someone that you have shared love with. And wishing this loved one these loving and kind intentions. May you be well. May you find peace. May you be happy. May you be free from harm. May you be well. May you find peace. May you be happy. May you be free from harm. May you be well. May you find peace. May you be happy. May you be free from harm. And thanking this loved one for being part of this practice, letting them drift into the back of your awareness, bringing into your mind's eye a vision of you, your authentic self, and sending those same loving and kind intentions to yourself. May I be well. May I find peace. May I be happy. May I be free from harm. May I be well. May I find peace. May I be happy. May I be free from harm. May I be well. May I find peace. May I be happy. May I be free from harm. And thanking yourself for being part of this practice, for setting the intention to bring loving and kind intentions, just as you would to others, bestowing those warm wishes to yourself. Thanks so much for practicing with me today.